I remember the day my brother, Ethan, gathered the family in my parents' living room with a trembling voice and watery eyes. He was a naturally charismatic individual, the sort of person who always seemed to have a compelling story up his sleeve. But that afternoon, there was a desperate edge to him that made me sit up straight. He explained he had been having unusual pains and dizzy spells for months, but he'd brushed it off, thinking he was just stressed. Eventually, he confessed he'd gone to the doctor. At first, he stammered he had received the horrifying news that he had a rare form of liver cancer. The moment he said the word cancer, the room fell silent. My mother gasped, my father turned pale, and a thick wave of shock rose in my chest as I watched Ethan wipe away tears. He stuttered that he'd waited so long to tell us because he couldn't accept it himself. He said the prognosis was grim, but there was a chance of survival if he underwent an extremely expensive surgery. Then he hung his head in shame, telling us he couldn't afford it without help. Not from insurance, not from anything. And that's when the trembling began in his voice, trembling that I took as fear, but I would later realize it was guilt. My immediate reaction was heartbreak. Ethan and I used to be inseparable as kids. We spent our summers building forts in the backyard, sneaking out late to catch fireflies, and making pacts that we'd always be there for each other. Even after we grew up and life took us in different directions, I became a high school math teacher, and he pursued a series of odd jobs that ranged from being a gym trainer to a car salesman. I never doubted that he cared for me. He had that magnetism that could instantly put me at ease. So in that moment, when he told us about his alleged cancer, all I wanted to do was stand by him. I thought about the pain he must have felt carrying this burden alone. My parents, equally devastated, rushed to hold him, to comfort him, to promise him they would do everything in their power to save him. We believed him without question. We didn't ask for medical reports or a second opinion. We didn't question the severity of the condition or wonder why the insurance wouldn't cover something so crucial. We were too caught up in the sense of panic, sadness, and immediate fear of losing him. The fundraising started right away. Ethan, ever the showman, posted on social media about his diagnosis. He wrote long emotional posts describing his condition and how he was coming to terms with the fear of dying young. He included tear-jerking photos, always with a hat pulled low over his eyes, looking sickly and pale, except that there was a slight ring of theatricality to it. At the time, I couldn't see it. I was blinded by concern, and I was proud of him for being so open. I thought it must be hard to share such vulnerability with the world. Donations poured in from friends, colleagues, and even strangers. My high school chipped in with a small fundraiser. People offered supportive messages, prayers, and encouragement. My parents drained their savings to contribute to his medical fund. I offered all I could from my own modest account, though I was never as financially well off as I would have liked. Ethan assured me any small amount would help. He wept gratitude every time he received a new donation, putting on a performance of trembling lips and clenched fists that radiated despair. Each moment felt more desperate than the last, and we all fed right into it. I was so busy worrying about him that I didn't realize how little he let us in. He never allowed me or my parents to accompany him to his appointments. He'd make excuses, saying the doctor's office had strict COVID protocols, or that he was rushing from work, or that the schedule changed last minute. Sometimes he said he just couldn't bear the thought of us seeing him hooked up to machines or looking weak. I respected his boundaries, trusting he was protecting us from the worst of it. But there were odd clues that might have tipped me off if I'd been less emotional. He didn't lose any weight, despite claiming his appetite had vanished. He never showed any hair loss or signs of chemotherapy. He never had medication around, not even the mild stuff used to alleviate side effects. But whenever I pressed him, he'd say something like, "It's experimental. I can't talk about it." Or, "I'm trying to stay positive. Don't make me revisit the worst details." So I always backed off. I didn't want to add to his misery or appear intrusive. In retrospect, it's amazing how readily we ignore inconsistencies when we want to believe someone we love. The first real crack in the facade came during a family dinner about a month after his big announcement. Ethan arrived late, looking disheveled, claiming he had just come from another consultation. My father asked him which hospital he'd visited this time, and Ethan muttered the name of a facility on the other side of town. My mother, determined to show her support, said she wanted to stop by that hospital to leave some homemade soup next time he went. Immediately, Ethan grew defensive, telling her it wasn't allowed, that there were policies against visitors in the oncology ward. My father, who had quietly been doing some research, frowned and said he'd read that hospital had lifted many of its restrictions. Ethan backpedaled, fumbling for an explanation. In that moment, I felt an uneasy chill, but I pushed it aside. I told myself the stress was getting to him. He was probably tired of explaining every detail to worried family members. But later, as I replayed the scene in my head, I couldn't ignore the flicker of panic in his eyes. It didn't match the sorrow or hopelessness of a terminal patient. It was the panic of someone who might be caught. A few weeks later, Ethan claimed he needed a sudden trip to another city for a specialist appointment. He said his doctors had collaborated with a renowned surgeon who required an in-person examination. By that point, the community had raised a substantial sum for his alleged treatment. Although we never had a precise tally, I suspected it was well over $50,000. My parents were drained both financially and emotionally. They had considered selling their car and taking out a second mortgage if it came to that. Everyone was so worried about Ethan's health that no one bothered to question the logistics of his trip. Except I couldn't shake my growing suspicion. I asked him if I could drive him to the airport or at least drop by his apartment the morning he planned to leave, but he insisted he had a friend handling everything. He wouldn't say who this friend was. The day after he left, I called every hospital in the city he claimed to be visiting, using a vague explanation that I needed to check on my siblings' well-being. No hospital had a record of him. The pit in my stomach hardened into something cold and furious. When Ethan returned a week later, he was all smiles. He claimed the consultation had gone well and that he was now on a waiting list for a life-saving operation. I recall standing in my parents' living room, watching him spin this tall tale about the futuristic facility he'd visited. He spoke about advanced technologies, robotic arms that performed precision cuts, and a team of doctors who had apparently never encountered a tumor quite like his. My mother was in tears of relief. My father clapped Ethan on the shoulder and said he was proud that Ethan was fighting so bravely. I just stared. I couldn't decide whether to cry or scream. I wanted to believe him, but my earlier phone calls told me otherwise. Yet, I didn't say anything in that moment. Maybe I was afraid of the fallout, of the heartbreak it would cause my parents if I confronted Ethan openly. Maybe I was still in partial denial. I felt stuck in a web of emotions, torn between loyalty to my family and an increasingly urgent sense that we were all being conned. So I waited, planning to dig deeper on my own before unleashing the truth. My next move was to track down any paper trail. Ethan had never shown us an actual medical bill or prescription, always hand-waving that he would receive them digitally and forward them later. He never did. I decided to drop by his apartment unannounced one morning, hoping to catch a glimpse of something, anything, that would confirm or deny my suspicions. When I arrived, I found his apartment in its usual state, messy, with clothes strewn everywhere, half-empty takeout boxes on the coffee table, and gaming equipment scattered around. Nothing about it said terminally ill patient. I opened a few random drawers in the kitchen while he was in the shower, searching for medications or hospital documents, but I found none. Instead, I stumbled upon receipts for expensive electronics, new sneakers, and a hefty down payment for a fancy new motorcycle. My heart pounded as I flipped through them, each purchase more extravagant than the last. I heard the water shut off, and I scrambled to put everything back. When Ethan came out, I lied and said I had dropped by just to see how he was feeling. He grinned and offered me coffee, not suspecting a thing. My suspicions had blossomed into certainty. From that day onward, I decided I would not let him keep spinning his deceitful story. Yet, I was meticulous. I needed proof. The biggest problem was that my parents were already so emotionally invested that a mere accusation from me wouldn't convince them. They would think I was mistaken, perhaps projecting my frustration or overreacting to a misunderstood detail. So I chose to gather irrefutable evidence. I quietly began reaching out to a private investigator I found through a friend of a friend. I explained the situation. My brother was claiming to have a terminal illness, raising money from everyone, and refusing to show any real documentation. I wanted the investigator to follow Ethan's financial transactions if possible, and to see where he went during his so-called treatment sessions. It cost me a chunk of my savings, but I was done letting him exploit our family. I also confided in only one friend, Serena, who had always been level-headed. She offered to help me follow Ethan if needed, to take photos or gather statements from neighbors. We plotted discreetly, determined not to let Ethan suspect a thing until we had a mountain of evidence to confront him with. Over the next few weeks, the investigator fed me tidbits of information. Ethan had no record of hospital visits matching his claims. Instead, he was frequently seen at upscale bars, nightclubs, and shopping centers. He'd purchased a high-end gaming computer and placed a deposit on a sports car, though he hadn't told anyone in the family about that yet. In one instance, he even rented a beach house under a false name for a weekend getaway with a group of friends. The money we believed was going toward life-saving medical treatment was fueling his lavish escapades. Meanwhile, my parents were skipping their own medical checkups because they couldn't afford them anymore. My father had a bad knee that needed surgery, but he was putting it off, convinced that every penny counted for Ethan's survival. My mother had canceled her annual mammogram, claiming she'd reschedule once they were in a better financial position. Watching them sacrifice themselves for a son who was lying through his teeth lit a fire in me. I seethed with anger, but I kept it hidden behind a veneer of concern. I wanted Ethan to remain clueless until I had the perfect moment to confront him. As the evidence piled up, so did Ethan's audacity. He began hosting online fundraisers, broadcasting live videos where he'd speak softly about his condition, occasionally pretending to cough or struggle for breath. Each time he did, donations from kind-hearted strangers spiked. Some of my colleagues, seeing me as a worried sibling, contributed whatever they could. At school, students even organized a bake sale to support Mr. Carter's brother. Every day, I stared at my phone, reading the investigators' updates about Ethan's nightlife escapades, while also receiving messages of sympathy from people who had no clue he was a fraud. My stomach churned with rage and disgust. At times, I wanted to blow the whistle immediately, post the screenshots, the videos of him dancing at clubs, the receipts for his expensive toys, but then I'd imagine my parents' faces. They would be crushed, humiliated in front of everyone they knew. And I realized a public scandal might overshadow the real issue. Ethan needed to face serious consequences, not just embarrassment. So I bided my time, working with the investigator to build a case that would be impossible for him to explain away. I was determined to let the hammer fall hard. Eventually, the investigator compiled a file thick with bank statements, surveillance photos, and screenshots of Ethan's own social media activity under various pseudonyms. He was bragging to certain friends about the money he was raking in. He called it his genius hustle, laughing about how gullible people were. The final straw was a short video clip the investigator obtained, Ethan at a nightclub, popping a bottle of champagne and boasting loudly, "Here's to a life free of worries." The timestamp matched a date he'd claimed to be in the hospital for a chemotherapy session. My blood boiled when I saw it. The day had come for me to act. I arranged a family meeting at my parents' home, telling them it was crucial we discuss Ethan's treatment plan and finances so we could figure out the next steps. Ethan showed up, looking a bit wary, but still confident. My parents were anxious, expecting to finalize some plan to possibly refinance their home. In the living room, I set my phone to record and calmly took out the investigator's file. At first, Ethan wore his usual expression of feigned sorrow, but as I flipped through pages and photos, he began to tremble. My parents were confused, demanding explanations from me, from Ethan, anyone who could clarify the bizarre evidence they were seeing. I showed them the bank statements that revealed large deposits from crowdfunding sites, money flowing into Ethan's account almost daily. I showed them screenshots of him partying when he was supposed to be hospitalized. I played the nightclub video for them, forcing them to confront the horrifying possibility that their son might be a con artist. My mother broke down in tears, while my father's face turned ashen. Ethan tried to stammer some excuse, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that the video was old, that the bank statements weren't accurate, but he couldn't keep his lies straight. Finally, he broke down, admitting he wasn't sick. My mother sobbed uncontrollably, asking him how he could do this to us, to all the people who had opened their hearts and wallets. My father just stared at the floor, silent, his lips pressed into a thin, trembling line. I stood there, feeling equal parts vindication and heartbreak. I hated seeing my parents in such distress. But I also felt relief that the truth was finally in the open. Ethan's eyes darted around like a trapped animal, searching for a way out that didn't exist. That's when he started begging for forgiveness, his voice raw and frantic. He insisted he never meant for things to get so big, that it began as a small lie, and then it spiraled out of control. He claimed he planned to return the money eventually, that he was just waiting for a big investment to pay off. My parents looked at him with a mixture of betrayal and disbelief, still trying to reconcile the son they loved with the manipulative stranger standing before them. My father finally asked, in a voice that quavered with anger, "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Ethan fell to his knees, tears streaming down his cheeks, begging for another chance. It was a pathetic sight, but I felt no sympathy left in me. I thought about my parents' sacrifices, the late-night tears, the crippling anxiety, the phone calls I'd endured from teachers and students who were moved by his story. I thought about the donors who'd given money they didn't have to spare, and then I thought about how Ethan had been blowing it on luxuries. Something in me turned ice cold. I told him this wasn't going to be swept under the rug. There would be consequences. "I'm calling the police," I said, my voice cold and final. Ethan froze, his eyes widening in terror. My parents gasped, but neither told me to stop. I dialed right then, explaining that I had evidence of fraud against my brother. There was no forgiveness, no mercy. He had betrayed every shred of trust we had. I watched him get handcuffed in my parents' driveway, screaming for me to reconsider, but I felt only grim satisfaction. I hoped he understood the weight of his lies. My parents turned away, tears streaking their cheeks. I stood tall, clutching that file of evidence like a shield. I would never forget the look on his face as they took him away. He had hoped for pity, but all I had left to give was righteous retribution. No one would ever pity him again, least of all me. And I regretted nothing.